So I work as a product evangelist for a fintech here in Berlin and Hamburg. And I also am a founder of a cybersecurity and regulation training company. So my tenure at the fintech will be ending very soon, and everything else will be starting for me. So regulation as a service. Oh, yay, my clicker works. Okay, it wasn't working earlier. Sorry about that. Why regulation as a service? And why is compliance important? So I like rules, and I like Germany because Germans like rules, so it's fantastic. When we talk about regulation as a service, we need to kind of do some history and talk about the evolution of open banking and PSD2. So open banking and PSD2 have very much similarities to them. Open banking came first in, got too excited. Open banking came first in the UK. From that came PS2, which is Payment Service Directive 2. And what they both do is allow for innovation to occur when it comes to the development of products for the financial services sector. They both care about and want to be able to follow data and allow data access from banks to fintechs and the new players in the field. And for PSD2, it's important to have security measures to be able to understand who is the provider of the domain of the bank and have integrity using EIDAS certificates, which we'll talk about in a bit. So for PSD2, PSD2 came about because there was a need to have an integrated single market for the EU to understand how the flow of money is going back and forth when it comes to payments, and to deter anti-money laundering and things of that nature. With the rise of fintechs, there came organizations called third-party providers, account services providers, payment services providers, allowing for these fintechs to work jointly with the banking industry to be able to offer services like multi-banking account switches, all type of things that you can think of that allow for the bank to retain their customers and still be able to produce innovative products. Additionally, in order to make sure that these new organizations were doing the job correctly, there has to be a need for new regulations. How do we make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing the right way? And that's part of where PSD2 came from, to be able to regulate the banks as well as the new fintechs on the scene, and being able to keep the data of clients in the EU, customers in the EU, and transaction data secure. So the essentials of PSD2 is strong customer authentication, which we'll go into a bit more because that goes directly into APIs for PSD2. Again, protecting customer data, having transparency with the payments, understanding that these payments aren't being used for terrorism, making sure that these payments are being used for money laundering, things of that nature, and of course reducing fraud to individual consumers. So with PSD2, we also have to talk about GDPR. GDPR, the acronym always confuses me because I switch up the letters. So the General Data Protection Regulation, the most important part to know about that is that each and every consumer within the EU has the right to be forgotten. They can say if they applied for a job, there is someone's job bank, they can say, take my information out. I don't want any of my data within your databases. And they have that same right with any financial institution they do business with that is part of the EU. They also have right to their individual data to see what's happening with their data, and have the ability to, as EU citizens, be able to decide what they want to do and make sure that their data is not being sold. As you can hear from my voice, I'm a total American, and we have no data privacy. Our data is up for sale all day, every day. So being here in Germany is quite nice for me because I live here now, so my data, as long as I'm in the EU, working with EU institutions like my banks that I have here, safe. But all my banking information in the US, not so safe. That's why I get bombarded with information to buy different marketing material. So when we talk about API standardization, I have to talk about the confusion that no API standardization has. With PSD2, there was a set of specifications that came out for the PSD2 directive across EU by the European Banking Authority. With that, they said, okay, we want to implement this new directive, go do it. So each individual regulator within each country had to figure out how will this be done. BaFin in Germany has been the best with figuring out how to do this because, again, rules are everything here. And they found a way to figure out how to make this the best by working directly with fintechs and banks on the best way to implement PSD2. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Some of the issues that came up with the working groups that were working with the European Banking Authority and also working with the working groups for open banking were the ambiguity around certain terminology. Some of the terminology was between authentication versus authorization when it comes to ISO standards, and what exactly does that mean? How should we look at that? Like really going into the details. And then they gave recommendations on how to improve this. Additionally, there were issues when it came to dynamic linking. Should dynamic linking be done within a browser of a web page, or should it be done with an app of the bank? How do we want to do this dynamic linking? So there was a lot of feedback from the different organizations working part of the working groups to give the information back to BaFin and the Berlin group. This is part of the regulatory bodies here in Germany, which in turn gave that information to the European Banking Authority, who shared it with the other members of the EU who are responsible for regulation, which are typically the central banks throughout the EU. And so from the PSD2 came the regulatory technical standards. And this is where you had a lot of the information, all of the information essentially of the technical responsibilities to abide by PSD2 and to be in compliance. From that came the strong customer authentication, which of course we're going to talk about, and I'm sure you probably heard this a lot already, because PSD2 technically was supposed to take effect September 14th. We're in October, and it has not taken effect. They gave it an extension because people couldn't figure out how to get it done right. And banks were definitely being super shady when it comes to the PSD2. So they gave it an extension for BaFin, and so did the European Banking Authority. So in order to be PSD2 compliant in the organization that I've been working for, we have managed to be compliant and met the deadline of September 14th, and did so by building on the flow that we already had for the user. So the user flow prior to PSD2 was essentially to do screen scraping and using FinTS to gather the account information in order to work with the banks for the services that they needed. And so during that process, that was able to take credit card non-payments as well as, at the time, payments before PSD2 said, you have to implement this. And we either did single-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. But now with PSD2 there, we're ensuring that, of course, well, even in the old version, we had a client ID in secret using OAuth and OAuth 2 now. To try to make sure that we're in adherence with the communication security standards. And so, yeah, I was going to get to that right now. Okay, you threw me off. You made me a little nervous, but okay, I got it now. TPP is third-party provider. So that's essentially a fintech that's providing a service to a bank or to another fintech. So the organization that I'm with, FinLeap Connect, is a third-party provider and also a provider of account services and payment services because they have a special license from BaFin in order to do that. And we'll go into more detail about that in a second. But having these certifications are important, which I'm going to do on the next slide. The certification that we mainly use is QWOC. And for the certification, once you have the certification, the bank has it, the TPP provider has it, and the certifications are basically okay from each other. Then the process moves on to the PSD2 API, and there has to be the consent. And the consent is what makes the PSD2 API unique in a sense, because you can have embedded, decoupled, or redirect consent from the user. And this is requiring the user to do several different types of, hey, there we go. Got it? Okay. You see it, right? Okay. Okay. So it allows for two-factor authentication. So for the EIDAS certificates, and EIDAS is Electronic Identification, Authentication, and Trust Services. Sorry, I had to look because I forget that acronym every time. But that's the main certificate we use when we work with the banks dealing with PSD2. There's also the QSIL certificate. For the QAct certificate, it allows for the bank domain to be validated, for the integrity to be there, because there's plenty of there's plenty of bad actors out there who can create a completely real-looking bank, almost identical to an actual bank, and distill the information. And we're using the certificates, it allows for us to know exactly who we're working with to be able to offer the services we do using PSD2 APIs. So for the consent, the 3 different types of consents there are. Embedded is the first type of consent, and for embedded, it allows for the customer to be able to go to the bank's website and be able to do a transaction like multi-banking. But in order to do that transaction, the bank has to verify who this person is and that the person is who they say they are based on 2 factors of authentication. So you have to have either your password, or you're going to have something that only you would know, like your credit card number or something like that. And then you can do a mobile TAN or a photo TAN or a different type of TAN that allows for facial recognition or biometrics or something like that. It just depends on the bank. The second type of consent is decoupled. The second type of consent is decoupled, and decoupled is allowing for the customer to use the bank's app in particular. So like we were working with a big client out of the UK who has banks globally, and they wanted to use decoupled. And so you had to use their special app that they created that's supposed to be PSD2 compliant. And the customer would receive a push notification through that app to be able to go through the 2-factor authentication. Now, when you're testing for compliancy with open banking versus testing for compliancy with PSD2, you're going to find a lot of hiccups as developers because of how the specifications are set out in each region. The last one is redirect. So redirect allows for the customer to go into the bank's website, and they will essentially, our app, and they'll essentially be redirected to the third-party provider. This is where compliance as a service, regulation as a service comes into effect. Regulation as a service says if I am a account service provider or a payment service provider and I have that special license by BaFin saying that I'm this provider, I can lease out my license to another organization so that they can have access to that license and be in compliance and offer products and services quickly. In order to do that, though, the organization requires that the end user knows who's the actual holder of the license. So not only will the end user see the bank's information, but the end user will also see the information and logo information of the third-party provider so that they know who has the license and they know they're working with 2 different organizations. But then they'll be redirected back to the bank's website. So essentially, regulation as a service for the organization that I'm working with. They're allowed to do this because they have the license from BaFin. It has a really long German name with like 25 letters, and I can't even say anything more than Dankeschön, so I cannot pronounce that particular word. But they were one of the first organizations in Germany to get this license. We work really closely with BaFin and work as lobbyists. So there's a lot of lobbying happening with fintechs and with the banks to make sure that the regulators understand what issues are happening. This is also cloud platform based, allowing for integration and connectivity into banks or other fintechs. And when I say fintechs, I mean anyone who's taking payments of some sort for a service like insurance, investments, anything you can think of that's almost banking related, maybe a little bit outside of banking, but still you're dealing with large amounts of money that can be applied to it. Also, it's important to know in order for us to work directly with banks and with fintechs and be able to provide information such as you have something here in Berlin, in the EU called standing orders. Standing orders is a term I didn't even know what that was until I got here. So that's like a bill that you pay every month, and you're paying it to Vittenfall. That's where I have my electricity from. I hope I said it right. But you pay this bill monthly all the time. And so we have machine learning models that have huge amounts of data that has these categories of the most common payment providers and most common organizations that take payment of some sort for individuals would help with the services that we provide to our partners, which are clients. So these machine models are essential to our regulation as a service platform. And so I had mentioned earlier that we do a lot of lobbying. So it's not just one organization doing lobbying, but it's several different organizations that have form a coalition here that do, and I'm mainly talking about Germany right now, who do lobbying with BaFin and with the Berlin group so they can understand that, okay, we're trying to work with these big banks, but these big banks are saying that they don't understand how PSD2 is going to work, so they're going to cut off all access to their data, which means that it can kill a fintech because fintech's whole revenue stream is based on the data that they pull from the bank, working with them to provide these services to clients or to the bank's end users. Again, we also offer or did offer, actually still in the process of offering PSD2 API testing, specifically geared though towards large banks, our credit card providers within the EU, not just Germany. So we have had good traction with that, some large organizations taking advantage of that, and then we're able to take that data, those reports from the testing, and share that with BaFin so they understand the what is it called? Some of the roadblocks that are being faced. Last but not least, when I say integrated semi-white label, I say that because remember I said earlier that when you are leasing your license to another organization, that the end user has to know who actually holds the license for the payment initiation services. So that's why it's semi-white labeled. And for our partners who are using our regulation as a service, the benefits that they get are that they're able to release products quickly once they have a contract with us to their users. If there's an issue, they're able to pivot. It's also an ability to have an extra layer of security and transparency because we had a phenomenal chief regulation officer who is like she's super into rules, like super duper. So our security and transparency is top notch. And then there allows for the ability to have innovative services and do these services in a way that can be beneficial to clients and net more revenue for the company. So the customer data, although we are accessing customer data, we're accessing customer data in a way that is anonymized so that we only need exactly what's necessary to provide the services and nothing more. So these companies, hopefully you can see them. I use blue. I'm not sure how well that is on a big screen, but these are some of the companies that use our regulation as a service here in Germany. Actually, Barclaycard is in the UK, but it is Barclaycard Germany too. So these are the companies that we're working with now. There's a lot more companies there, but these are just the ones I grabbed their logos and put them on the PowerPoint. So when you're not in compliance, as you may know, there are hefty fines. PSD2 is still not fully implemented across the board, as I mentioned, so there's the extension. And because of that, the fines haven't really been there yet, right? They're giving people time to catch up. And I'm not talking about the original PSD, I'm just talking about PSD2. But I did pull the fines for GDPR because GDPR and PSD2 are like a marriage. They go hand in hand. You have to have both of them because you're dealing with customer data. And so you have to be careful and protective of that data. But these companies have had huge fines in the last year. Google has had $50 million fine, but that came out of France. Marriott has had $110 million fine. Delivery Hero, like right down the street, had €195,000 fine. And then N26, one of my banks here, had a $50,000 fine, right? So these are pretty hefty fines. I mean, of course, these organizations have, prepared for these type of scenarios, but who wants to lose that much money? So, I mean, and there are ways in order to avoid this. I did have a link here of where I found these fines, because these fines are being tracked across the EU for all companies and individuals. In Germany will fine an individual or a small business owner who contacts people using email and they accidentally put everyone on the email. So now you not only see your email address, you see everyone else's. That's a fine. I saw that. It's crazy. But that's how serious GDPR is. So the future of compliance trends. So in my opinion, the future of compliance trends would need to be API standardization. At some point, as PSD2 really comes into full effect across the EU, there's going to be, and matter of fact, there already are talks and plans and laws in the work for PSD2 3. We haven't even mastered 2, and they're already trying to roll out 3. So it's absolutely necessary at some point to have API standardization if we're going to be able to help companies stay compliant with PSD2. Also, there are many organizations out there right now doing risk analysis in the reg tech field, which is regulatory technology. Increased risk analysis using AI and data analytics will skyrocket, because that's the best way to avoid having unnecessary fines if you can reduce the risk early on. Additionally, having AI-based compliance training that is on demand and gamified in the way that people can learn quickly and not be hoarded into the room, kind of like you guys are now, and have to have a compliance training for 1 hour while you're all on your phones. This way, users will be able to get the training they need as they need it instead of wasting time. Also, I do believe that regulation as a service will become more and more popular. More organizations will start doing it because it helps fintechs to avoid the long, drawn-out process it takes to get a payment initiation service license, which is a PSD2 license, essentially. That time frame takes a year to 18 months just to get the license. By that time, whatever product you have is already outdated. You probably would be on your 3rd iteration of that product in 18 months in tech speak. So this allows for the ability to quickly launch and scale for products across the board. And lastly, cybersecurity. Financial licensing, I should have put it down there, but cybersecurity is extraordinarily important when you're dealing with payments, because you have to be cognizant of anti-money laundering across the board, not just in the EU, but if payments are traveling across Asia, Africa, the US, Canada, and US gets hit the most for data breaches and for fraud. So whenever you have payments moving across the world like that, you have to take that into consideration. So why regulation as a service? It's a way to retain your customers, keep brand recognition strong, not to lose revenue or go out of business because you have fines that you can't pay. And it's a way to make sure your brand reputation is solid. So thank you so much for your time. Yay, we're done. Thank you.